Pagliacci Schumer was out on the press avail yesterday talking about the foreign aid bill that's passed out of the Senate now. And, of course, talking about his longtime comrade. That would be the big guy. President Biden. Mental acuity. It's as good as it's ever been. Interesting way to put it.
First, when I talk to President Biden, regularly, sometimes several times in a week, or usually several times in a week, his mental acuity is great. It's fine. It's as good as it's been over the years. I've been speaking to him for 30 years since we worked on the Brady bill and the assault weapons ban when I was a young congressman. He's fine. All this right-wing propaganda that his mental acuity is declined is wrong. He's going to win the election because he has a great record.
Okay, it's good enough for me. Let's move on then. And we should, by the way. This reminds me of the run-up to the debates in 2020 where everybody was talking about how, and Trump too, Biden's dead on his feet, there's no way, he's not going to be able to utter a sentence, and so on and so forth. And I never understood that. Why are you participating in what the press wants you to do, which is to lower expectations for Joe Biden? What kind of sense does that make? And it turned out to largely backfire. So what kind of sense does it make now to obsess about this? He's not going to be able to serve a second term. Why is that your concern? Their party, he and their party are saying he's fine. If 85% of the American people see something different, well, then I guess they should vote on what they see. What do you want him to be replaced? Or do you want him to stand for election? Do people ever think through these things? Or they just, we're so trained to just sort of jump on whatever grenade is rolled out there by our opponents. Relax about it already. Everybody saw Thursday night. Everybody's seen the last 4 years. It's zipping around social media at the speed of light. So let it be. Focus on other things. Substantive things. Alternative visions for this country. People's quality of life concerns that begin with, frankly, their cost of life concerns. Oh, and by the way, nobody in the D.C. press corps had the heart to ask him, which I appreciate. It was very compassionate of them, very magnanimous. What? To ask Pagliacci Schumer. That presser on Thursday night, sort of buried in everything else that occurred that evening, was Biden again saying that Bibi Netanyahu's response to the Hamas terrorist attack was over the top. Over the top. You had Chris Van Hollen, who's a Marxist senator from Maryland, essentially say that Netanyahu, and by extension the Israeli state, are war criminals, though he voted for the aid package. Of course he did. Of course he did. Because, he's got Ukraine and it's got some other things in there, too, like this. $10 billion in migration funding. So $61 billion for Ukraine and $17 billion for Israel. $10 billion in migration funding.
What does that mean?
It's portrayed as humanitarian aid for Ukraine and Israel, but the text of the bill allows it to be spent on, quote, other vulnerable populations. Other vulnerable populations. You know how money's fungible? Like when Brandon Johnson uses COVID money to house migrants in Chicago? That sort of fungibility characteristic. Yeah. So other vulnerable populations give some latitude, I would argue, a lot of latitude, open-ended latitude to POTUS to divert funds to, well, I don't know.
Palestinians, Hamas?
Migrants, sanctuary cities, other vulnerable populations, whatever they define as vulnerable.
And that's their backdoor way of federally funding this invasion that I believe we're having in our cities of Chicago, because they keep going back to D.C. begging for more money.
You say invasion, I say importation. When you're financing the entrance, when you're opening the door, I have a hard time calling that an invasion. You're bringing them in, that's an importation. But, I get that a lot of people like the other I word. For more on all of this, including what may or may not happen in the House on this legislation and what should, pleased to be joined again by Rich Goldberg. He's a former National Security Council official and U.S. Senate aide, currently senior advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Rich, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Hey, good morning.
So what is your handle on this $95 billion foreign aid bill?
Well, as far as I can tell, it's dead on arrival in the House, per the Speaker. And so the Speaker, obviously, last week tried to move a standalone bill just to support our ally in Israel, while there was still obviously no movement from the Democrats to get serious about the border. And that did not get through the House. A number of Republicans joining almost all Democrats in voting against it. Now, that needed two-thirds based on the rule he brought it up on the suspension calendar. He could bring that bill back under a traditional rule that just needs a majority vote and put that back into the Senate and put Schumer back on the clock and Democrats on the clock to support our ally in Israel. That obviously needs more munitions and more support. While we continue to talk about the elephant in the room, which is our southern border. You've talked about it ad nauseum. Everyone's talked about it, and nothing is actually being done in a serious way to try to secure our own border. And I don't know how you go back to that caucus as the Speaker of the House and say, we're going to send this many dollars for economic and humanitarian assistance and all that to other places, and we won't do anything about the crisis in our own cities. We won't do anything about the crisis on our southern border. That is not to diminish the importance and criticality, in my view, of ensuring Vladimir Putin does not walk through Ukraine and then on to Eastern Europe. I think that would be a massive national security disaster, is to expose the problem we have on the other side of the aisle of not being willing to get serious and meet our own need at the same time. And, listen, he's the Speaker of the House. Republicans have the majority. It's on them to put forward a plan, in my view, and say what you're for. It's one thing to be against when you're in the minority. When you're in the majority, you should show the American people what you're able to do, and then show the American people what would happen if you took the Senate and what the roadblock is in Chuck Schumer. So if I were the Speaker, I would go ahead and write the bill the way you want it. Put forward the border requirements that we need to secure our border. Put the hardware, the dollars we need for the military equipment that Ukraine needs not to fall this year to Vladimir Putin. Put forward the dollars that Israel needs to finish off Hamas and stay strong against Hezbollah in the north and the Iranian threat throughout the region, and lob that into the Senate and force the Democrats to have to defend why they're opposed to it.
Well, on the House side, they have done that on the border. They did it a while ago, called H.R. 2. So,
Correct.
I mean, I guess you can, restate that and attach some aid to Israel, and that would be about it for me in terms of under consideration. Because I think one of the frustrations people have, talking about this a lot, is they're a little perplexed that we seem to be on both sides of these wars while we're getting moralized too about Russia in particular. Well, if Vlad Putin is such a bad guy, and he is, then why is our energy policy such that it enriches Vlad Putin, that it enriches the mullahs in Iran? So we're underwriting Russia and Iran, and then we're supposed to write checks to Ukraine. We're underwriting Hamas through the UN Relief and Works Agency, and then we're supposed to give money to Israel, but we're also going to give more money to Gaza residents, which is going to go through that same Hamas-sponsored UN agency. It's like I'm a little tired of being on every side of everything, and then if I oppose anything that would sustain that paradigm, then I'm
100%
I'm anti-American.
You are 100% correct, and I have said this repeatedly. Early on, when the president had made a supplemental request, I said, the president proposes, Congress disposes. That's the old motto in Washington. write the bill way you want it, end all the sanctions relief for Iran that the president is continuing to provide today. There is money being transferred to Iran today under Biden's policies that is underwriting all of the fires throughout the Middle East that we see, from Gaza to Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq. It's absolutely nuts. Oh, and by the way, also helping Russia, because Iran's providing the drones and maybe soon ballistic missiles to Russia as well. They use Iran for sanctions evasion. We know that. So put that into the bill. Strip out all of this gunk that the president's trying to put in that, as you say, would fund both sides of conflict, that is completely without oversight and likely to go into corrupt areas, waste, fraud, and abuse. Stick with hardware, stick with the defense industrial base here at home, make sure we're focused on the primary threat of China in the future, and don't let our Democratic allies fall on the battlefield.
Well,
and by the way, secure our border.
Oh, yeah, that would be nice. Well, speaking of waste, fraud, and abuse, what about American taxpayers' support for the UNRWA, also known as United Nations Relief and Works Agency?
Wow. So $6 billion from 1950 to 2018 to a so-called refugee agency. And just so everyone has context, there's actually a UN refugee agency. It's called the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And then there's this other agency called UNRWA that was set up right after Israel's War of Independence because all the Arab armies wanted to keep a few 100,000 Arabs who had left their homes as political pawns and tell them, hey, we're coming back, we're going to push the Jews into the sea, don't go anywhere, you're refugees. There was an equal number of Jewish refugees back then that were expelled from Arab countries. They were all absorbed into Israel or the United States or Europe, wherever they went. But not these Arabs. They were kept in refugee camps. Fast forward 75 years, they're still considered refugees. Only their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren have all been considered refugees, all administered by this one unique organization that doesn't recognize Hamas or Hezbollah or Islamic Jihad as a terrorist organization, has schools to indoctrinate kids to hate Israel, hate Jews, grow up to believe they're getting ready for the Arab armies coming back to invade Israel and genocide the Jews. And then we're surprised, after $6 billion over 70-plus years, that this agency actually produces what its mandate is, and that is something like October 7th. Now, 2018, why did I use that year? That's the year Donald Trump cut off this organization and said, we're not funding it anymore, this is crazy. And in 2021, Joe Biden comes into office, flicks the light back on, and has funded more than $1 billion since 2021 to UNRWA prior to October 7th, and still wants to keep the money flowing even after we now know that their employees are Hamas. Some of them took part in October 7th. I mean, this is an agency that is the worst program on a good day for a U.S. taxpayer dollar to ever enter the door from. We should not be funding them a cent ever again. It shouldn't exist. There are other UN agencies and organizations that can do humanitarian work. It is time to dismantle UNRWA.
He is Richard Goldberg, former National Security Council official and U.S. Senate aide, currently a senior advisor at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Rich, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
You bet.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
Patients everywhere are experiencing joint pain relief thanks to QC Kinetics regenerative treatments. So how does this non-surgical approach work? QC Kinetics medical director Dr. Aaron Wolkoff explains.
Is like when you get a paper cut and the cells that come onto that scene first stop the bleeding, and then it recruits more cells to form new skin and new soft tissue. And then you look down a week later, 2 weeks later, and it's like nothing happened and that paper cut never existed.
In this same way, QC Kinetics uses your natural biologics to help repair repair and restore aching knees, hips, shoulders, and backs.
We take those same similar cells in different areas that are arthritic, are painful, and we cause this kind of internal self-healing that can resolve patients' pain.
Relief without surgery. See if you're a candidate for QC Kinetics regenerative treatments.
Call QC Kinetics 312-809-5955. That's 312-809-5955. 312-809-5955.
Guys, it's